Okay, we're now live. Welcome everyone to the next in our series of events to mark the 5th anniversary of the referendum back in 2016. To those who were watching yesterday, I can reassure you that while I'm on the same computer that wouldn't charge yesterday and that went flat at the end of the event, it is now charging. So far so good. And we're delighted to have a fantastic panel of Katya Adler, friend and colleague Hussein Kassim, friend and colleague Georgina, Wright, and Lindsay Appleby here to talk about the future of UK and EU relations. But I figured, actually, before I go on, let me just flag to you the fact that Hussein is one of the authors of a report we've put out today that will be with you in the Slido on the future of UK-EU relations, which I recommend to you most strongly. I would, wouldn't I? But before we start looking at the present and the future, I thought it might be nice to reflect backwards quickly and just say to the participants, what has struck you most about the last 5 years? Have they unfolded as you might have expected that they would have done 5 years ago today? What has surprised you about the way things have gone in any particular order? Everyone's looking down. So Hussein, I'll pick on you.
Yeah, so I spent most of my career looking at how the UK coordinated its EU policy, and everywhere you go, everybody admired the UK for its ability to understand what was happening over the other side of the channel, but also in the other member states. And I suppose the thing that surprised me most was that the UK didn't really take the unity on the EU side very seriously. And I think that's come as a sort of constant surprise. I think that's sort of, that persisted throughout the 5 years, and it sort of, in a way, has continued if we're to believe what's been reported over the last couple of weeks. And I think it's a real problem, because it really is a threat to what happens next.
Katya, your reflection on the last 5 years?
I would say that as a by now veteran EU watcher, even though I've sort of forayed elsewhere in the world in between, I was quite blindsided by the EU unity, I think, during the negotiations. I'm used to seeing a very fractious EU. Don't forget, we've got EU leaders meeting today. Again, they've got a summit and they're going to argue, as they always tend to argue, over migration or Eurozone reform. And over those Brexit negotiations, pretty much they remained united. Often inside the EU, there are these criticisms that big countries, Germany and France, ignore the welfare of the smaller ones. Ireland, though, was front and center in these negotiations. So I think the fact that all the big countries, sometimes against their own economic interests, were willing to stand behind Ireland when it came to negotiations with the United Kingdom, I think that took a lot of people who know the EU very well by surprise. I think also, if we go back to the political temperature of 2016, Anand, remember, Brexit, there was Trump, there was all this talk of after Brexit will come Dexit, Italexit, Nexit, Frexit, so many other countries were going to leave. And actually what we see is there's more EU enthusiasm now amongst the member states than there's been for a long time. I'd argue there's Brussels skepticism, but not that Euroscepticism where countries are really saying, I want to leave too. So I think that's changed very much. And also what we couldn't have predicted on the day of the referendum, and once the result was known, was what kind of Brexit there was going to be. And the reason that the EU couldn't predict it is because quite clearly the United Kingdom didn't know what kind of Brexit it was going to get either.
Well, I, for one, miss hearing you most days on the Today programme these days, Katya. Georgia, let me just say, for those of you who are interested, as you should be, in the forthcoming French elections, you should sign up to the Institut Montaigne, because their stuff is very, very good, and also, handily enough, tends to be in English as well. Georgie.
Thanks, that's a great plug. And it's to a certain extent, everything surprised me, nothing surprised me. In the sense, unlike Katya, I think EU unity didn't come as a surprise at all. I almost expected it, and I think that's because the shift, from being kind of an internal negotiation when you're a big member state, and that's where you do see a lot of division. But the EU is actually quite united when it negotiates with a third country. But that, of course, the UK was in that position where it was still a member state for part of the negotiations, and then it became a third country. And I think that shift of dynamic, a lot of people, I think that definitely took people by surprise. Am I surprised about where we are now? Not really. I think there was always going to be a period of mourning before there can be really real constructive thinking about the future, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But in a sense, it's kind of, now that I'm looking at the EU and I'm seeing everything that's going on there, I sort of look back to these years and think there's so much that happened, and then your helpful graphic and timeline of everything that happened. And I mean, it's just quite remarkable that the UK and the EU were able to strike an agreement, particularly given that the EU usually takes between a year and a half and 7 years to conclude a simple trade agreement, and this was much more. So surprised, but also not really surprised.
So I suppose I'd added a rider to that today might show that when the EU were talking about talking to a third country, they might have some pretty big fights, as I think we're going to see today over Russia. But Lindsay.
Yes, well, thanks very much for inviting me on the panel. I'm in some ways a little bit more like Georgina in that I think many things were not really very surprising. The fact that Brexit and a country exiting the EU had never happened before meant that there was a lot of emotion and a lot of politics, which has taken a long time to settle down. There wasn't really a roadmap for doing this. The Article 50 process only gave a certain amount of guidance. What I would say, I think surprised me a bit was actually how the consensus around doing the right thing about citizens' rights very quickly just became a reality. And I actually think there's a huge success on citizens' rights across the whole of the EU in general. There are some problems. We're concerned about some of the issues on the EU side, and they're concerned about some of the issues on our side. But I think that actually turned out to be quite a straightforward discussion, because it was one of those areas where we had the same objectives. And I actually think the debate about money turned out to be more straightforward than people expected as well. I think what has been more surprising probably is how uncomfortable it feels to me the EU still feels about aspects of EU exit and the UK leaving, because we have gone for a very broad relationship, but one that is quite obviously based in precedent. And I think that it is quite challenging for the EU to really decide what strategic sense it wants to make out of such a broad-based relationship with a significant neighbour on its borders. I think that that's reflected a bit in this concern that the UK is seeking to divide member states. I genuinely don't think that's the case. I agree that in the early stages of the Brexit debate, there was quite a bit of mention of that. But I think that we're comfortable and have been comfortable with the EU taking a common position together about what's in its interests. Where we've set out what we've tried to do is to set out in hopefully quite calm and reasonable terms where we think there is a shared interest in doing something together. And in some of those areas, as is well attested, we think we could have gone a bit further on services, on an SPS agreement. Those kind of areas, we think we could have achieved a bit more. Thanks.
Okay, interesting. Before I come on to the TCA, because I think that's where we should go next, let me just quickly plug our EU settled status report that we will stick in the Slido for you all, that goes into, I mean, that actually recognises the fact that the settled status scheme has been an enormous success, whilst pointing out that actually with the scale in terms of numbers that we've seen, even a relatively small scale failure can involve tens of thousands of people. So we'll stick that in the Slido. But moving on to where we've got to, do we think that the trade and cooperation agreement provides a sort of stable basis for long-term relations between the UK and the EU, or not?
So if I start this time, I think potentially it does, of course, but you need both sides to play ball. And of course, if you ask the UK or if you ask the EU, each side will say the other one isn't playing ball. For example, you have an agreement and not all I's or, are dotted, T's crossed, because you can have something on paper, but it has to work on the ground. Obviously, the protocol is a really, really big issue here. The idea of having these agreements is that you can solve problems together as they arise. And I think both the UK and the EU would say, actually, we're not solving things together at all. When it came to vaccines, the EU acted unilaterally over the protocol. The EU feels that the UK is acting unilaterally repeatedly also over the protocol. I think that privately both sides would say there's not very much trust kind of in this immediate term. And I would say longer term, the UK and EU would hope that things would settle down. I think, you do have to separate, obviously, the protocol and the actual trade agreement. I think whether the protocol itself can survive, I think there's a big question mark over that at the moment. The trade deal is there. It needs to be worked out and worked on, I think, by the two sides. I think at the moment, it's 5 years since the Brexit vote, but it's very early days in the trade agreement. And I think it's really difficult to judge it right now.
Okay, we'll come back to the protocol. So in a sense, if we can talk about TCA minus protocol, I'm sure we'll get back to more specific things on the protocol later on. Georgie.
I come in because I think Katya's absolutely right. And I was, one of the things that I was really surprised about is how badly some people on both sides wanted the negotiations to fail throughout the 5 years. And I feel like there are still some people now who say it's an awful deal and we should get rid of it. But mostly I think the consensus has shifted to let's try and make it work. And you sense that in EU member states, you're seeing like practical cooperation between customs officials, for example. You're seeing, I mean, obviously I'm not a party to the discussions in the Joint Committee or the Joint Partnership Council, but presumably they are trying to resolve disputes. They're trying to show ways that they can overcome some obstacles. So in a sense, I think that is a positive step, but can it evolve? I mean, we know that sort of the TCA reflects kind of the ambition on both sides, I think, and Lindsay's right, there are probably ways that both sides would have liked to have improved it, and the EU have said repeatedly that they quite like the idea of having a structured foreign policy cooperation, but that's seemingly not something that the government wants. And so again, there is an onus on both sides to think about, okay, if we are going to cooperate in areas of mutual interest, how do we do that, given our limits on what we're prepared to do in terms of formal cooperation?
Either of the other two want to come in? I mean, Lindsay, it'd be nice to hear your view on this, I think.
Yes, I thought I would wait for others, having been so involved in negotiating it. I'm obviously a bit kind of party pre.
The natural sort of parental pride.
Yeah, a little bit of that. I think that broadly, I think it is a success, and I think that the implementation is actually going quite well. I think that the fact that at the Partnership Council we had sort of 4 or 5 issues overall out of 15 different chapters, and by chapters I mean big chunks of agreements that often would be separate agreements in a different context. I think that shows that actually most of it is working really well, and most of it is providing a stable base. The fact that we're not talking about truck drivers or transport systems or electricity in a dramatic way, all of that I think is actually quite a successful unpicking and reforming of what is a complex and multifaceted relationship. I think the fact that the JHA provisions are working well on law enforcement, that's actually a huge achievement. And there were people for quite a lot of last year who were saying we wouldn't be able to achieve anything on law enforcement. I think Georgina's right, though, to pick up the areas where the TCA doesn't cover as well. And I would actually say that in some of those areas, I think there's now quite a good track record of success that I think people wouldn't necessarily have predicted at the start of the year. For example, sanctions announced at the same time on Russia, on China, most recently on Belarus. That for me is an example of a foreign policy relationship that actually sort of reflects shared values. Obviously, the sort of return of more traditional transatlanticism has helped there. There's no doubt that that creates a sort of safer political space for that. But I actually think it shows, similarly to the very good engagement that we have on climate change and the preparations for the Conference of the Parties, it shows there's a lot that's going on outside the treaty that is also really positive. I absolutely accept, Anand, that we'll come back to Northern Ireland, but I do think Katya's right that actually the big challenges are around the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the rest of the challenges are the kinds of things you would expect as you move these complex agreements into practice. For example, fisheries agreement. hugely complicated agreement. One of the things that took us really until the end of the negotiation to find ways forward, a little bit less finished in that regard, possibly than some other areas, really to do with the complexity of the issues around fisheries and the fact you need to work those through. But here we are, we've got an annual fisheries agreement in place. We're building the relationships with other partners around the Northeast Atlantic. And there's actually rather a good story to tell about implementation on fisheries, I think, overall. But surprise, surprise, some of the changes don't work in a way that everyone is happy with, and that's because it's a very changed relationship. Thanks.
Yeah. Can I just add something to?
Absolutely.
I mean, I think that. I think obviously having the agreement is a real achievement, and it's far better than the alternative. I mean, there is a lot of unfinished business there, and I'm sort of worried about some of the, I wouldn't call them loose ends exactly, but they are places where the two sides need to come to some accommodation. They are there are deadlines for that to take place, and I'm a bit sort of concerned about that. I also think that the review parts there are flashpoints there, and I wonder where we'll have got by the time that they materialise. But I also wonder whether sort of COVID hasn't concealed a lot of the impacts and difficulties and fallout from the deal in ways that that make it possible or easier to cooperate at the moment. But when the sort of the full difficulties are sort of revealed, as it were, it might be much more difficult to sort of manage those. And that's where I think the truck drivers come on and comes in, and where the infrastructure actually, the infrastructure from the UK side also plays a part. So those would be my concerns. But it is really encouraging about the cooperation beyond the agreement. I think that the foreign policy examples that Lindsay cited are really, really important.
If I just a quick aside, I think from talking to people in the EU, that's often a kind of a side comment they make. Obviously, they're very focused on the Northern Ireland Protocol, and I know you'll take us there, Anand, but we really have to get there. But their comment then is isn't it ironic that they're saying to me that actually we're cooperating best on things that aren't in the agreement, like foreign policy, whereas things that actually are on paper between the two sides are not working so well. And on fishing, Lindsay, I think that inside the EU, there's a feeling that some of the traditional UK allies, like Denmark, for example, are so fed up of the whole fishing question that actually in internal EU circles, when they're talking about a future relationship with the UK, it's not that they've turned their backs, of course not. The whole of the EU and individual member states know that it's absolutely in their strategic interest to have as close a relationship as possible with the UK. But there's that feeling of fed upness and mistrust, which and it's not even just about the protocol. It's been the whole of the last 5 years, issues for individual countries like fishing, that has made the member states quite happy to hand this over to the Commission rather than getting too involved themselves, and also raises questions like, why isn't the EU thinking more long-term about its relationship with the UK? The TCA is, that's not going to be the end of it, for years to come. And yet when the EU sits down, it's got a policy paper on Ukraine, it's got a policy paper on countries in Africa, and not one on the UK. And I kind of get the feeling in the EU at the moment, it's just like, it's just too much, fed up, got other things on our plate, and perhaps I would say they're not paying the attention that they should on a member state basis, which I find quite interesting.
I think we'll come back to that as well. Now, we're getting an awful lot of questions in, which means two things. Firstly, if you in the audience can vote for the questions I'm a bit flaky on this, but if you can vote for the questions you want me to pose to the panelists, I will do the ones that you find most popular. And also, I think all the panelists don't need to reply to every question, so we can keep this moving. But I want to come back to you with something specific on this. Just two areas maybe where I sort of wonder whether the current status quo is sustainable. Firstly, is it really sustainable that musicians, accountants, academics, for heaven's sake, might need visas to pop over to the European Union to ply their trades? And that's something that we're going to have to talk about sooner rather than later. And Ian Bond raises the point about foreign policy. He says, the US now has in place policy dialogues with the EU on China and Russia. At some point, isn't the UK going to have to institutionalise its foreign policy relationship with the EU a little bit to coordinate better? Any but preferably not all of you, I think is the
Oh dear.
But do feel free just to chime in, or just don't answer, I suppose.
Well, I think there's a bit of that I'm maybe the most logical person to kick off on, to be honest. On the foreign policy relationship, I think there's no need to kind of rush. I think that's the point that we were making during the negotiation. Is I think we're not opposed to structures, and we're not opposed to structured discussions, but we never believed that the relationship should be conceived of as a single monolithic treaty-based organization. We didn't believe that would be the best way to actually get cooperation going. And I'm sure if there came a specific issue arose, as it has most notably the last few months on sanctions, but where there was a desire to work together on a stabilization objective, whether in the neighborhood or more broadly, I think that we would use those organic relationships we have to build the kind of responses that we need. So I think that's what I would say about the foreign policy piece. On the on touring musicians, so I think it's an interesting area where you've got a mixture of member state and EU competence, and there's a lot of member state competence here. There are lots of different rules which attach themselves to every different area of kind of work in different member states, and the basic nature of the relationship on migration was sort of defined fairly early on the two sides, whereby the EU would operate in terms of the constraints that its Schengen systems put around it, and it was clear it wasn't planning to amend the Schengen border code in any significant way, and that's reasonable enough. And we were clear that we were going to operate a global migration policy. I think that does leave space to keep working on areas of common interest. And as you know, the specific example of touring musicians, there are 17 member states of the 27 who I think have rules that we would characterize as more flexible. 10 who, no doubt for good reasons of their own, have particular rules around work visas which work in a different way. And we're working with those member states to take that forward. It wasn't possible to achieve anything on an EU-UK-wide basis during the negotiation. I'm not going to recap the different perspectives on why that was the case, but it wasn't possible to achieve that. But we're confident that as we move forward, we can keep trying to find pragmatic solutions with each of the member states involved. And that isn't a sort of divide and rule tactic. It's simply a recognition of the areas where member states will be acting and where the EU will be acting. Thank you.
I know you don't want us all to speak, but I think this is just quite interesting if we're throwing forward as well as looking back. And I think that, the EU, as it was holding these negotiations with the UK, kept holding on to the idea that, maybe when the heat has gone, has started dissipating from these negotiations, maybe the government in the UK will be, quote unquote, from the EU perspective, more reasonable, more open to things like agreeing something on freedom of movement, or when it comes particularly to Northern Ireland, for example, getting some kind of veterinary agreement that, both sides could sign up to. I think what's changed is that the EU is not kind of waiting for anything, but it knows that depending in future years, the flavour of government that you would have in the UK, this is a relationship and this is a trade deal that is there to be built on or taken away from. It's not solid forever and for always. And I think that when we look forward, that is something that you can see. We always talked about a narrow agreement that the Johnson government was looking for, and it's actually turned out to be more broad-based than many had thought. In the future, it could become closer, more broad-based, or become more distant. I mean, all of that, lies in the future, and is nothing that we can predict at the moment. But something I've seen is that the EU has stopped sort of waiting, hoping. It's just kind of getting on with it, if you like.
I'm going to press on. I mean, we've got a number of questions around a broad theme that I'm going to summarise as to what extent are current UK-EU tensions, or the frostiness in relations, structural or contingent? So I suppose what that means is structural in the sense that if you leave, it's bound to happen, because like it or not, there are people on both sides of the divide who rather hope that the other side fails. Because it's good politically at home if the other side can be seen to be doing badly. So that would be the structural argument. Contingency is either because of the way negotiations panned out and the sort of ill feeling and lack of trust that Katya talked about, or is it even more contingent than that? Is it down to personalities? David Frost is apparently a slightly more acerbic character in meetings with the EU than Michael Gove was. Boris Johnson is, well, he's Boris Johnson. So just sort of trying to sort of step back and analyse why things are as they are, where would you sort of look to for an explanation? Georgia, you look ready to speak.
Yeah, I'll take this one, or at least in part. So as I said at the beginning, I think there was always going to be a period of mourning, and because it was a fractious sort of 5 years, and the negotiations went on until the bitter end, and there was ultimately going to need a period where you just sort of try and implement the deals that are in place, and then you can start thinking about the rest. But I think on the EU's perspective, there is this frustration, and I agree with Katya that their patience is wearing very thin, and that's sort of in the Commission, in the Parliament, and in the Council, because they feel that the UK isn't playing by the rules. So it's the sense that we negotiated in faith, we signed these agreements in faith, and why are they not being fully applied in faith? And actually, there are processes in place to kind of raise disagreements, and that's why, incidentally, when the UK government recently requested an extension for the grace periods under the Northern Ireland Protocol within the Joint Committee, that went down very well, because it was like, it's not a unilateral decision, it is actually using the process in place. But I do think personality matters, and in a sense, it's not just how Lord Frost gets on with Maros Sefcovic, it's also about his personal relations with capitals. And my sense in Paris is that a lot of people don't really understand Lord Frost. They don't really know what his sort of, they think they know his convictions, but there are a lot of other things that are unknown. So I think some sort of personal outreach in that respect is important. And I'll just end up by saying, I think a lot of member states would quite like strong bilateral cooperation with the UK on a range of issues, even if it's just dialogue. But some smaller member states feel that they're just not going to get the same attention as the larger member states. And that's also why they're pushing for, in terms of foreign policy, an EU-wide structure, because they think that that's the easiest way for them to be listened to and to have a really kind of a regular dialogue with the UK.
Thank you. I'm in a state of mourning over the cricket, so I'm not taking any questions from the New Zealand High Commission today, so don't bother wasting your time by asking. Hussein?
Yeah, I think that George is absolutely right about the smaller member states. I think that this was one of the benefits of the sort of Barnier task force model, that everybody felt that they could participate. It was all transparent and open, and I think that now in a way we're back to there is a sort of central venue for discussion, but there is suspicion that all these discussions are happening on the outside. And do we know about these? Do we know what's going to happen? I think that's really important. But I think also the EU doesn't. It's a process-based institution. We know this because there are so many member states. They will have to be kept on board, and they've agreed the rules, and the rules have to be sort of pursued. So there's a very strong and heavy process element to that. But I think at the same time there is a sort of difficulty in how to read the UK. Is the UK the sort of traditional country they've always known that takes rules seriously, or is it, I'm not going to say a rogue state, but is it one that we can't sort of predict, we can't trust? And what are we going to do about this? It's a big neighbour on our doorstep. It is a difficulty. Most of our neighbours, the EU would say, are people that we do business with, we have relationships with. Although I think the Swiss case is a bit of a counterexample to that now. But these are states that are engaging with us positively, and one day will probably be member states. That's not the case with the UK. It's an anomaly. It's difficult to read and understand. And it's explicitly made it clear that it wants sovereignty. It wants to be away from out of the reaches, beyond the gravitational pull of the EU.
Katya?
I think sort of on a day-to-day level at the moment, still after quite bruising negotiations, there's a there's an issue of kind of at each other. You know, the UK says to the EU, "You're ideological, we can't work with you," and then the EU says, "No, you're ideological. All this stuff about sovereignty, we can't work with you." You know, there is an element of that which is just built on the fact that the last 5 years have been extremely tough. But I think that the really bad relations comes down to the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the kind of things that I'm hearing is really strong stuff like, you know, the UK was the UK, but it's put as a question, but I know what they think. Was the UK disingenuous when it signed the Northern Ireland Protocol? Did they negotiate in bad faith? i.e., is it possible that the UK just signed up, Boris Johnson basically signed up to the agreement just to get on with it, just to then get a trade agreement, but with no intention of respecting the Northern Ireland Protocol as it exists on paper? Now, this is not at the fringes that I'm hearing it. This is like right at the centre of the EU. It's not in the Commission. It's amongst the member states, including member states who are allies of the UK, still really want a close relationship with the UK, but are really, it's not just fed up, but I think I'd say like the look on their faces anyway is kind of disgust, anger, and an insistence still that, you know, Ireland is in the club, and there is no way, whatever happens with the Northern Ireland Protocol, that Northern Ireland will become like a second-class citizen within the single market. So this is still a very live issue, and this brings like some of the rancor of the negotiations. It's still very much in the bellies of the member states when they come to talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's not just about the single market, it's this bad faith question that a lot of member states are really holding on to. And in the words of one member of a very key member state, not France, said, slowly but surely, because of the protocol, we're all becoming more French when it comes to the UK. That's not in the UK's advantage, I have to say, when it looks on sort of building and moving forward in this relationship with the EU.
Okay, Katya, you win. We're gonna turn to the protocol, if that's all right, Lindsay, unless you want to come in on this.
Well, I just think it might be. We've heard quite a lot about the frustrations at the EU end, and what I would say is there's quite a lot of frustration at the UK end. And then, I mean, I absolutely agree we should go on to Northern Ireland, and I'm not going to come back on those points at this point. But on the structural question, I think that there are many in the EU who still seem to want us to be closer than the relationship that the government has very clearly set out that it wants, which is an FTA-like relationship. People will have different views about that, but it's a very clear and it's a very simple model. And I think there's quite a bit of frustration on our side that there are these accusations that we're not implementing the TCA. We absolutely take issue with that. Absolutely take issue with it.
Pardon me, I meant with the Northern Ireland Protocol. Sorry, just to be very clear. I apologise. That's what I was specifically talking about, Lindsay. So, yeah,
no,
sorry.
But, I mean, just to pick up Georgina's point, actually, because I think she was talking about the TCA. We are implementing the fisheries agreement. We're implementing it in full. It's a complex agreement. It was a difficult agreement to reach, but we're absolutely implementing it. We're implementing the really complex JHA agreement. Where we see problems with member states or with the Commission, we raise them. We think there are significant problems facing UK nationals stemming from the withdrawal agreement and the way some of that is being implemented. But we raise those issues with the intention that the implementation goes forward. There are problems with extradition, a highly sensitive political issue in a range of member states. Our immediate recourse is not to insist that the EU has no intention of implementing the agreement. It's a recognition that some of these issues that take time, but that they will need to be resolved. So I do think it's important to set the record straight, because it isn't the case that there is a sort of difference about the way the TCA is being implemented. And some of the frustrations on our side about the quite surprising things, I think, to go back to the structural point, it's quite surprising that the EU wants us to be part of a sort of gravitational space, when our understanding is there's a clear understanding that isn't the kind of relationship that we picked. And I think some of the personality and the sort of individual-based comments as well, I think if you look back at the history of the last 5 years, some of the things that EU leaders and EU negotiators have said about the UK over that period of 5 years, understandably, lots of politics and emotion, but are quite extraordinary on their side as well. So I don't think it's the case that personalities and those sort of contingency issues should be sort of attached in a one-sided way to one side or the other.
I think that, incidentally, looking at my camera, I'd just like to make it clear for the record, that's my son's Arsenal scarf, and it will be removed after this session. But on the protocol itself, I mean, one of the things you hear quite a lot around here, I'm in central London at the moment, is a frustration amongst British officials that you'll hear the European Union being very, there's an insensitivity to legitimate unionist complaints about the protocol, and people saying things like you shouldn't give in to the threat of violence if unionists are threatening violence because of the protocol. Whereas during the negotiations itself, when that was the other way around, which is you can't have infrastructure on the island of Ireland because it will get blown up, that seems to be what the conversation happened the other way around. So there is a frustration in this country, or in the government at least, about how the EU views the protocol. But now we get to the question, which is, can the protocol be made to work? We've had a couple of questions in actually asking if it can be renegotiated, which is an interesting issue. But do we think, panelists, do you think there is a way that the protocol can be made to work given where each side is at the moment? Lindsay, if you want to say yes, if the EU is more flexible to kick us off, that would be fine.
I'm very happy to kind of set out where we are on the protocol. I mean, from our perspective on the protocol, it's important, I think, to set in context that the protocol was always a means to an end, or to various ends. It wasn't an end in itself. And the most important end, from our perspective, was and remains the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the balance that that represents between the communities. The negotiation of the protocol was fraught. I think it's fair to say. I don't think any of the panelists would disagree with me on that. Happened over a series of stages, in our case with two different governments, and produced something that I think is objectively was a much less finished piece of treaty than some bits of the TCA. I say that because it was explicit that very significant parts of it would need to be developed through implementation. And I think that is very obvious on the face of the protocol and with the work that was delegated to the Joint Committee for it to do. I think reflecting the complexity of the objectives around the protocol, there are obligations in the protocol that point in a variety of directions. There is a clear obligation to ensure that trade east-west remains fluid and that the UK customs union is protected. And that is important. And for us, the balance within the agreement and trying to find ways of implementing it which reflect that balance has always been critical. I think that it is that process that needs to continue, of finding ways of achieving the objectives that we all want, that there is political stability in Northern Ireland, that political stability is reflected in strong, sustainable institutions in Northern Ireland, that it isn't perceived to be to the detriment of one part of the community or another, and that the outcome of it needs to be a prosperous and successful Northern Ireland. And the challenges that we are seeking to address in the implementation of the protocol are about issues which arise from it not being guaranteed that there will be that kind of success on Northern Ireland, whether that is about pets and guide dogs, whether that is about what kind of medicines are able to be used by the NHS in Northern Ireland. Those kind of issues, and the fact that it is a special set of processes which was designed to meet a specific circumstance rather than any sort of external border of the EU in a classic way, that's the set of issues that we're trying to address. We want to do that in a way that is consensual, There were a lot of challenges at the beginning of the year, and we took a set of actions which we judged were necessary to provide more political space for the discussions on the protocol to continue. Those actions were controversial, but we're confident that we took them for reasons which support political stability in Northern Ireland. And that will continue to be the government's absolute priority. Thanks.
I'm going to come to Georgie in a sec because she's got a view from a particular and important member state that I'm keen to hear. But Lindsay, just to press you on one thing, would you say it's fair to say that however the EU, however sort of liberally or sort of soft-touchedly the EU agrees to implement the protocol, there is still going to be the need for some, however minimal, checks on trade between GB and NI. So it will not, trade between GB and NI will not be like trade used to be between GB and NI, however flexible the EU choose to be.
We've always been clear that we recognise the benefits of some additional process because we have a shared objective to also ensure that the north-south trade is protected and the achievements made in terms of the economy across the island of Ireland, those are protected. So we've always absolutely understood that the EU would need reassurance that Northern Ireland did not in fact operate as a backdoor into the single market or undermine human health or the legitimate objectives of the Union in any of the areas that are of interest and priority to it. So we absolutely recognise, and always have, that particular solutions will need to be found. It's obviously the case that there always were processes to treat Ireland as a single epidemiological unit, for example. And I think the analogy is processes like that, processes that don't create an identity challenge and don't create a sort of profound sense of disequilibrium in Northern Ireland. No process of change, I think, was going to be straightforward. But what we want to do is work to see if there are ways of ensuring that those changes are not destabilizing in Northern Ireland. And that does mean, from our perspective, that the very real problems that have emerged with the way the protocol is operating really need to be addressed. And I would say, because I think it's sometimes something that people don't focus on, that there is a lot of professional work going on in the Commission on a whole range of these issues. There are a lot of highly talented officials on the Commission side working on these issues, people working in good faith. We feel that they need to be given and to be encouraged to explore creative solutions and solutions which really address the broad range of problems that exist. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Georgie, you're now based in France, having to deal with all that substandard food. But I mean, what do the French think about the protocol? What's the attitude of the French government towards this debate?
So it's really interesting because it's kind of the French perspective is it kind of depends slightly who you talk to. I mean, if we think that France was pretty hard line from what we hear during the negotiations, Macron actually very early on in the Brexit negotiations made one point in passing. I think it was outside the European Council, and he said, a lot of people in the UK voted to leave, and we need to be listening to. We need to honour that decision, and we need to be mindful of what they want. So he was very much, we have to protect the EU's interest, but we also need to be mindful that not everyone in the UK might want the same type of relationship that we do. Not everyone in the UK regrets the relationship. So coming back sort of to the Northern Ireland Protocol, I think France's view is that it wants to make it work, first and foremost. And of course, that requires both sides to be pragmatic. But when the TCA when the text was published, the government line was caution, caution, caution. And to come back to you, Lindsay, I don't think I think the French government know the difference between sort of the application, la mise en œuvre of the withdrawal agreement and the TCA, but the broader policy world in Paris kind of confuses both, and that's because they're not always on top of every twist and turn of the Brexit negotiations, and also because many of them just simply switched off, and because they focused on sort of everything else that was going on in the EU, France's position and everything else. I I think the, as you say, controversial announcements, decision to unilaterally extend, that kind of damaged trust, but it made it much harder for the Commission to then try and find ways to be more flexible, simplify perhaps some of the detail of the Northern Ireland Protocol, because EU capitals who don't always follow this day to day sort of turned around and said, well, why are they doing this? And we have to be tough. So again, I think process matters, trust matters, but ultimately the G7, I think the message that came out of the French government, but also the other EU governments present, was we need to make this work. And also we need to, at some point, move beyond Brexit and think about our broader relationship. But I think there is a recognition in Paris that they need to make it work. The problem is, can we see some detail? And actually, in terms of some of the proposals that have been put forward by the UK, there is a sense of, can we have more data? Can we see how it would work? And I think that might do, again, wonders to kind of try and find ways to perhaps make it work within the confines of what's already on the table.
Katya.
I think adding to what Georgina said, Macron said recently, the UK signed up to the protocol. It knew perfectly well what it was signing, because, we've had various voices saying, it wasn't clear how it would work. And it's impossible to go back on it now. I think there's frustration also in the Commission, Šefčovič, when there was just working out these grace periods back in November, December. He said to the UK, are you sure these grace periods are long enough? And the UK said, yes, absolutely. So there was frustration then at unilateral moves earlier in the year, as we've heard relief at the request for the chilled meats, and the fact that there's now going to be an agreement and a further extension. I just have to share with you the German word for this, which is Wurstelstillstand, which in German a ceasefire is Waffenstillstand for your where you put down your weapons. This is putting down your sausages, and actually there's relief in EU circles that this could be done in an amicable way, and a desire that this would be the way forward. I think it goes down to this fundamental mistrust now as to whether the government ever intended to honour the protocol as it is, and if it never intended it, whether when Boris Johnson said all those months ago privately, that we've all seen the video, oh, there will be no checks, was it just a slip of the tongue and a lack of knowledge, or was it actually intentional on what he intended the government to do? And I think that mistrust goes right through the Commission, has bled into the capitals. And as Georgina says, there's now amongst the member states well, yes, we could be more flexible, but we don't feel like being more flexible. And when I said earlier, this is not good for the UK, what I mean is the knock-on effect. It means that the EU is sitting on an agreement on financial services. It means that the EU is sitting on an agreement about data sharing, which is very much in the UK's interest. And I think also, and obviously the EU has to move on from this. They do, because this is just reality. But again and again, you hear this argument that the fact that the way that the protocol is working in Northern Ireland is politically destabilizing. The EU view is the UK should have known that Brexit would be destabilizing in Northern Ireland, that you could see that right from the beginning with the vote, that pulling away from the EU, and especially a hard Brexit, and then signing an agreement that keeps Northern Ireland, let's not forget, in the single market for goods and in the customs union, even though legally, of course, it remains part of the United Kingdom, was going to be difficult and was going to cause political difficulties. So there remains that it goes right back 5 years, where the EU says, you voted for this, you made the choice of what Brexit you want. You had to know that this itself was going to have a destabilizing effect. And why should our single market and member state Ireland suffer as a result? So that's still what you hear in passionate terms.
Hussein, do you want to come in on this at all?
Yeah, and it's not. I mean, this starts from the member states. I mean, in my view, also. I mean, the Commission certainly feels this, but it's also. The response of particularly smaller member states. Denmark is one in point. That the UK is an ally, but look at the way it's behaving on this. I mean, the trust is lost, and so that leads to a tougher line on enforcement. But I'm also sort of struck by a sort of fundamental paradox, really, that Lindsay was talking about an FTA relationship. But an FTA relationship is fine if you're the other side of the world and you don't actually have a border, and these aren't your neighbours and your most important trading partner. And so, a very specific concern needs to be taken into account of that local problem and sort of continual relationship.
Anand, I will shut up now, but I have a tiny point to make, which I'd forgotten.
You're right ahead.
which is again, what you hear in EU circles is that they know they need to be more flexible on Northern Ireland, and they know they don't want the people of Northern Ireland to suffer. They want, guide dogs, medicines, parcels, and definitely, now ahead of the marching season, something had to be done about, the sausage wars and so on. That was very clear in Brussels and in capitals as well. Something that the EU does worry about, the protocol, and whether it can survive, or what kind of agreement and compromises can be made with the UK, is that they worry again about the international reputation idea, going beyond Brexit. And sometimes when we talk EU, UK, we do forget this, but the Commission, who makes all the trade deals with other countries, is saying, we don't want to be seen as this entity that, when the going gets tough, has signed an agreement and will then allow it to drop. And that is something that, right or wrong, even though Northern Ireland is an exception and everyone realises that is something that is playing on EU minds.
It's quite a good segue to John. Actually, before I go any further, on behalf of all my very middle-class Northern Ireland friends, I should add seeds. The thing that annoys them most is the fact that Gardener's World will not send the seeds that come free with every issue to Northern Ireland anymore. And you would not believe the irritation that seems to be causing among some people. But so, John Pete, I mean, it's a really good question, I think. And it's about whether or not, is the EU just rubbish at dealing with neighbours that don't aspire to join? And does it need to think this through a little bit more? So, or that do aspire to join but don't really think they will. So whether it's Turkey, whether it's Switzerland, or whether it's the United Kingdom, does the EU need to start thinking in terms of a category type that isn't people who are so desperate to join they'll swallow whatever we throw at them, but actually there are a ring of states around us who are different, and we perhaps need to start thinking about a model of engagement that is outside of the sort of templates that we've normally used. Would that be fair, do you think? Sorry, John, if I've fundamentally sort of misrepresented your question. But
can I very quickly answer this, Anand? Because I think in 2016, there was genuine thinking in Brussels and EU capitals about how they could make sort of Brexit or the UK-EU future relationship a model for the way that the EU relates to its neighbours. But given the way that the negotiations unfolded and the lack of trust, and given actually the government's kind of vision for the future relationship, that didn't really go perhaps in the way that the EU hoped. But it takes two, doesn't it, to tango, and it takes two to make that relationship work. And I think there is some thinking going on in the EU about, because they are thinking a little bit about how they can relate with the UK, given what the government set out in its own ambitions. But there is a fundamental principle, and Katya just said it, which is the EU is very firm on this. It's, if you've negotiated something in faith and you've signed it in faith, then it needs to be respected in faith, and it needs to be applied in faith. And I think until we've kind of moved on from that, until EU capitals and Commission feel that has been met, that the Northern Ireland Protocol, that the UK has gone to great lengths to apply it, that's only when you can start perhaps trying to see if there's any flexibility within the text. But there is this sense sometimes that the Northern Ireland Protocol wasn't imposed by the EU, it was negotiated with both of them. So if you're going to think about a new model, then that needs to come through a negotiation, and both sides need to want a different form of partnership, and perhaps you need a better relationship all around.
Interesting, thank you. Katya?
I think that Macron is very interesting on this, Georgina, actually, because he came in, like, he's facing presidential elections, right? When he came in as president, he was going to reform France. He was going to reform the EU. Now, he hasn't managed to reform the EU. You could argue what Merkel's role in this, or all the other things that have happened that have stopped him doing it. But I think that something that he's always been aware of is Europe has got to go forward, however it does. And that means that maybe you need to go back to this old idea that's been knocking around Brussels on and off over the years, which is kind of a 2-speed Europe, or even a 3-speed Europe, or a 4-speed Europe, where you have an inner circle, and even amongst the member states, those who are more willing to take part in certain projects. But then, going further out, you would have countries like the UK or Turkey or Ukraine or others that will dip into EU business on some things and dip out on other things. I think, as I said, at the moment, the EU doesn't have this policy paper on the UK. It does need to think about it. And the Macron idea, maybe in the future, I mean, if he survives the elections, will be something that will be picked up on, of course, bilaterally. When we had papers in the UK, always fearing when we were a member state about an EU army, there is this very close cooperation militarily and on security matters bilaterally between France and the UK already. That is something that Macron would like to build on in the future. So I think, this is an area that the EU needs to think about, has to get better at, because it has to look at its own chicken coop inside. Hungary, Poland, these issues for the EU are definitely not going away. It's going to be erupting and being argued about right now between the leaders of the member states as they hold their summit. So yes, I do think the EU does need to get better on these kind of issues.
Lindsay?
Thanks. Just a couple of quick points. On the FTA point, I mean, there are lots of parts of the world where FTAs work quite well across long and complex borders. And, the Canada-US one is an example of that. And that's not to say it's an exact parallel or anything like that. But you can make FTA-style relationships work while allowing regulatory autonomy. And I think that is important. Having said that, I think we do absolutely accept, and always have, that the situation in Northern Ireland is distinct and unique. And that, that's what the protocol says. And the protocol is a reaction to a specific situation. It shouldn't be part of a sort of wider model. It should be bespoke to that. And the challenge we have in Northern Ireland, as reflected by unionist leaders, is that unionists have fundamental problems with the way the protocol is working. And the challenge in Northern Ireland is that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was obviously based on communities working together and finding ways forward that reflected something that they felt to be a good balance. That's why the power sharing institutions are set up the way they are. So we need to find a way forward on Northern Ireland that reflects the sort of ongoing dynamics in Northern Ireland. It isn't just a snapshot of a particular period. It needs to absolutely be sufficiently dynamic that it can create cohesion between the communities rather than differences between them. And I would say that I think the UK government actually did many things in support of that. And our record in the context of the negotiations over the past 5 years is pretty strong. The preservation of the common travel area, that involves choices at the UK end as well. The decision, notwithstanding the fact that there aren't north-south processes of any kind, to be clear that there should be unfettered access for goods into the UK, all of that represents a pretty significant commitment by the UK to do things that are unusual in the Northern Ireland context. Creates complexities for us in the trade relationships with the rest of the world. So it's that kind of appropriate responses to the very particular situation in Northern Ireland, which is what's at the core of our policy. Thanks.
Hussein, do you want to come in on neighbourhood, and then I'll come to you, Katya?
Yeah. So maybe it is the case that the EU needs to think about the neighbourhood and treating countries that don't want to be member states in a sort of slightly different way. Maybe it does need to think about what's the jargon phrase, differentiated integration, to deal with sort of Poland and Hungary. But I wonder if, even if it had done those, whether that would have been sufficient to have kept the UK in the EU, because the UK had a pretty good deal. It was opted out of many things, and so I wondered how differentiated the EU would have to have been for the UK not to have wanted to leave. And I wonder whether there's any sort of form of relationship sort of short of an FTA that Lindsay's described that would be acceptable to the UK now. I don't know how on the EU side there could be any sort of better offer, any more imaginative offer that would be appealing to the UK.
I mean, the one thing I would say is, just from the report that we put out today, what's one of the many things that struck me about it was how little systematic thought had gone into the medium or long-term future. That is to say, we are where we are for a variety of reasons, whether contingent or not. But looking forward, or is there a way that we could do things better, or sort of ensure that we can work together more effectively in the areas we need to collaborate on? I don't know. But Katya, you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to be positive.
Oh no!
Yes, I did, because I wanted to say that rightfully so we've looked at problematic relationships and problems that we can see going forward and so on. But again, when you talk to member states, they will also bring up things like very good cooperation in NATO, a feeling that with the UK you can cooperate very well on the green agenda, and that that there are issues aside from foreign policy where the EU can see that it will be able to work very well with the United Kingdom. And I think that again, this feeling of we're very up close to everything right now, and it's just also that ability to take a step back and realize that we can't leave the map that we're on. And there is a realization, I think, on both sides. We are neighbours, you need each other. And, so yes, it's problematic going forward. It's far from easy. And there are a lot of bad tempers and all sorts of things. But, even out of this immediate EU-UK realm, as I say, with NATO and sort of the wider environmental pursuit and relations now with Joe Biden, making all of that just a lot easier, perhaps everybody clubbing together on an attitude towards China, things like that. And again, I think we should look to the elections coming up now in Germany and France, because they will also influence, I think, very much relations with the UK. And I think it'll be interesting if the Greens do very well in Germany. I think that will lead to good relations with the United Kingdom, because they are actually closer to the UK, for example, on Russia, on China, as well as the green agenda. So, I think that sometimes we forget domestic policy in the EU countries and how that can affect the relationship. And we do have those big elections coming up.
Is it the expectation amongst member states that we plan to diverge radically when it comes to domestic regulation? Is that where they are now, looking at us, or do they think that won't happen? Does anyone have a sense of what their expectations are?
It's the fear. That is the fear. It's the real fear that remains. I mean, the kind of, the early on in negotiations was referred to as kind of Singapore on Thames. I think that when you poke at member states, they kind of realize that's unlikely, that it's going to be that extreme. But they do see that the UK keeps talking about diversion and changing regulation, and that does make the EU nervous. And I think it's not just political. It's not just about that the EU can't accept that there is this big entity, the UK, that wants to pull away from its orbit. That is there. But there is also just this, this is our regulatory framework. We don't want chlorinated chicken. We don't want this. We don't want that. Even if that doesn't come into an eventual trade agreement with the United States, it remains a fear, and it is a conviction amongst member states that when it comes to regulation, that the UK, however close still right now, of course, so close after actual Brexit, really, will be wanting to pull away in the future, also to its own advantage in certain areas, of course.
Maybe partly on this, Georgie, but if I can add another question for you as well, which is you quite often hear that President Macron would like Brexit to fail. What does that mean?
So yeah, quickly picking up on what Katya was saying, I think often the EU's fear also stems from the fact that it doesn't have confidence in its own position. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on, and they haven't really got a clear idea of where they're going. You hear about strategic autonomy all the time. Well, apparently during President Biden's visit, his officials were saying, well, what do you mean by strategic autonomy? What's the US's role in that? And there's a lot of disagreement, which Katya raised early on in the discussion within the EU about how you move forward. And so France's proposal is, let's have flexible formats. If we can't move together, then let's have groups of member states. But I think that's partly also driving the fear, because you're kind of keeping an eye out on what the UK is doing, but you also don't really know what you're doing. On the President Macron wanting Brexit to fail, I mean, my view is that yes, France have been hardline, but it's not that they want it to fail. Their two preconditions was, one, we have to make sure that the UK obviously doesn't get better access to the single market without any of the obligations than it would had it been a member state, and that was 100% making sure that basically member states have a better deal. And the second was, making sure that whatever the UK does doesn't undermine the EU or weaken its willingness to continue and its ambition and all the rest of it. But I don't really buy the fact that President Macron wants it to fail. And actually, I think you see, if you follow all his speeches, when he publishes his letter to EU citizens, he published one in The Guardian. And actually, in the circles in Paris, people are thinking strategically about how they can work with the UK at a bilateral basis. Obviously, they already have a strong relationship, but also from the EU-UK perspective. So I think for him, he needs to show that the EU is working, because that was central to his pledge when he was a presidential campaign. He's going to become a presidential campaign again. He wants to show that the EU works and that it benefits French citizens, and that it would benefit, they're better in than they are out. But does he want bad relations and Brexit to fail altogether? I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. We've got a really interesting question here from Jan Blomark, who's saying, one of the arguments that Brexit has quite often made was that outside of the European Union, British politicians won't be able to blame the European Union for everything that goes wrong. And actually, one of the fundamental benefits of Brexit is politicians here will have to take responsibility for decisions and their outcomes. Does the state of UK-EU relations rather imply that we're going to be blaming the EU for a rather long time to come in terms of outcomes, and that's not going to materialise in the foreseeable future? And it's a bit of a left field question. I think it's quite an interesting one. I mean, it does seem to me that we're locked into a situation where British politicians can point to the EU and say, well, it's them being unreasonable that's the reason for A, B or C. Or do we think that's going to change?
I mean, I think one of my recent conversations with a smaller member state who mourns the loss of the UK, still hasn't got over the emotional side of it, I think, is that, this person said to me, I completely see why, if you were the UK government, why wouldn't you use anything to your political advantage? So if there is fallout over Northern Ireland, or if there is a sausage war and it makes good headlines for you, why wouldn't you use it? And why is the wider EU remotely surprised if the government were to use it, or certain papers in the UK were to use it? So I think if we go back right at the beginning to that question of what has surprised us over the last 5 years, the fact that whether politicians or certain newspapers might sort of still like to blame the EU, I don't. Is that surprising? And doesn't the EU blame the UK government for having certain ideas when things are going wrong with I mean, is that surprising, Anand? I don't know.
Georgie, I don't think it's surprising, no.
I just think also that it's quite easy to forget when we're in the UK that if you look at sort of European media and stuff, they don't talk about the UK every single day. In fact, in terms of even when conversations that I have with other experts from different member states, when we talk about EU issues, EU relations with third countries, the UK often comes third or fourth. It's not always front and centre of the EU thinking, and particularly not of kind of, if you're looking at France right now, that's gearing up to an election. It's just had regional elections, it has a second round. I mean, these are the sorts of issues that are really, when they're talking about the EU, about what the EU is going to do on vaccines in the future, what the EU is going to do to support industry. It's not really the EU's relationship with the UK.
Anyone else want to come in on this? No need to if you don't want to.
Well, just to say, that I mean, the UK is really obsessed by the EU, and you see that sort of everywhere. And if it's not obsessed by the EU, it's obsessed by Europe. And but actually, there's also, from a sort of practical point of view, there's so much work to be done. I mean, working through retained law, working through this relationship. I mean, it's something that's going to preoccupy British politicians and the media for years. So it's unsurprising in a way.
And can I say that EU countries themselves, and they discuss this too, governments inside the EU do a lot of their own EU bashing and have traditionally done so. And I think when the EU is soul searching about where it goes and having a more positive image for the EU, which again is something that Macron has tried to push, this idea of bringing the EU closer to the people of the European Union rather than the Commission. This is something that governments struggle with, is that when the EU does something positive for them or for their countries, they'll claim it as their victory, whereas when it's something that it'd be a harder sell at home, they'll say, oh, it's Brussels. So I think the UK did this in a particular way, perhaps, but to a certain extent, you will see this mirrored in many, definitely the majority of EU member states.
Is it fair to say that whilst Brexit seems to have strengthened support for membership across the 27, it hasn't necessarily increased fondness for the EU itself? That's to say, populations are aware of the dangers of leaving now, having watched Brexit, and that it could be quite messy and complicated and time-consuming. But actually, that doesn't mean that they think that the EU is more effective than it was before. They just sort of think that we're stuck with it. Is that a fair character? George, you're nodding, which I like.
No, it's quite interesting to see Michel Barnier and how he's perceived in France. And actually, the fact that he led Wright, you said, a very successful negotiation has zero impact on whether French citizens like him more or less than before. In fact, when you look at Le Figaro, which is the centre-right newspaper, and you look at comments under interviews that he's had, they're like, well, you know, what's the EU got to do with us? And what about our own domestic issues? I mean, it's just really not a determining factor about whether you're popular or not. So I'm not sure really.
Katya.
Yeah, sorry, motor mouth again. I think it's very much like I said right at the beginning. Euroscepticism has dissipated across the EU in the way that we understand it in the UK, as in a desire to leave the EU. But the true sense of Euroscepticism, and so I call it Brussels skepticism, as I said at the beginning, is alive and kicking across the EU, and it is very much. It's not so much we're stuck together, and it's not just about Brexit again. Sorry, It's not just about us. It's this awareness amongst the member states, China, Russia. When Trump was in the White House and all of a sudden didn't have, Europe's back automatically on security matters, that made EU member states, particularly the smaller ones like, Denmark, which had flirted with the idea of leaving. If we were on our own in this world, how would we survive? And, that has helped push these countries much more back into the EU fold. And again, I go back to, I know Georgina said you weren't surprised about the unity, but the bickering and squabbling that goes on inside the EU, this is a squabbling family. But they're happier squabbling together than being sort of stuck on their own. And that's why you've seen, Le Pen or the Freedom Party in Austria, having to turn away from this sort of outspoken demand to leave the EU or even leave the euro, because there just wasn't enough sort of support for that idea in the population, not because they're in love with Brussels, quite the opposite, but because they don't want to be on their own and they feel like they're stronger together, I think.
Lindsay, I'm aware that you've been quiet for a while, and I haven't wanted to push you, but we're coming very near to the end of our time. So I thought, I don't know if you don't need to, but if you have any sort of closing reflections that you want to share with us, that would be nice, but don't worry if not.
Well, I mean, I suppose it's a tribute to UK journalism, how much UK newspapers are read across the continent in many ways. And I do think that sometimes creates a kind of particular perception of EU exit issues, and particularly given the different perspectives that there are in UK media about it. I mean, I suppose my broad perspective would be that there is more that is positive than meets the eye when you dig down into it. And, sitting at the middle of the problem is finding a sustainable solution for Northern Ireland and a politically sustainable solution in Northern Ireland. But as always, the sort of variety of views that exist across the EU is... it's very, very enriching to be here and very enriching to hear this debate. I suppose that would be my reflection, Anand.
Well, that's an excellent note on which to end. So let me thank you all, Katya, Hussein, Georgie, and Lindsay, for taking the time to do this. It's been really, really interesting. I apologise, as ever, to the people who've asked questions that we haven't got round to, but maybe we'll do this again in a year's time or something and try and come back to some of those questions. For those of you who are real suckers for punishment, we've got another event later today, which I think is at 6 o'clock, which is an In Conversation with Lord Frost, which should be very, very interesting indeed. So do tune into that. But for the moment, thank you very much indeed to the four of you. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you to all of you for watching, and see you soon.